Well, so we have 4 innovators in the world of procurement up here on stage. Some of you work inside of government, some of you work outside of government, some of you have switched back and forth between the two. So you've had your eye on what's happening with procurement, particularly of interest to this audience is what's happening with procurement at the local level. And I'm curious to know, we've been having this conversation for a while in a lot of forums, including the one that we're in right now. And I'm curious as to what you all consider the sort of current state of procurement inside local government today. What's working? What's new? What's different? What's changed? Where are the biggest roadblocks? Who wants to go first? Yeah, Wayne.
I'm happy to just share a little bit. I think that in terms of procurement reform, there's definitely an approach that's looking at, can you look at the rules as they are and stay within them and innovate within the existing rules, which is kind of what we try to do with this multi-city effort. Why $5,000? It's because it's below the competitive procurement threshold for all 4 cities. So we can sole source that $5,000 out really quickly. The other reforms that I think that is currently going on is, how do you actually change the rules? How do you begin to look at those types of current practices like existing thresholds and begin to make it more flexible? Are you seeing, with CityMart, just very innovative approaches, so looking at these big problem statements and saying, don't define the solution, see if you can actually find the best thinking to address that problem, rather than dictating a dollar amount, a process that involves many different departments that might not even touch on that problem.
Absolutely. I think we are seeing that in Oakland as well, where we've kind of had business as usual. We've been dealing with these procurement thresholds and trying to work underneath them. But I think the awareness is being raised now, well, this isn't working for us, and how can we change it? And I think a lot of times people say, well, this is just a policy, this is how things are. But we have the power to change the policy and to lobby our policymakers to do that and to get their buy-in. So I think we are seeing the conversation moving forward, particularly because there's this awareness and this increased, I think, technical literacy among public servants as well, and wanting to bring technology into government.
I think the thing I would add into that, and this goes back to the government as a platform piece, is that it's about the problem, right? We have to remember it's about the problem. And then the real power of government in here is convening the ecosystem of players to go after solving that problem, and bringing the data and bringing the tools and bringing the key actors together. I think that the beauty of Sasha's model is how deeply he gets into the problem and clarity around the problem, such that he can do a lot of that. But the problem wins. But government doesn't own the problem. We all have to be about the outcome and then pushing the ecosystem to get that outcome done.
So, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, I can for ours, but maybe one thing that we found a real enabler was that everyone understands that technology is out there, and that serves as a really good argument, but the problems we get, the problem statements we get, are not about technology as such. They don't come from the technology departments. They are resource problems. They're about adult social care. They're about wicked big spending items where everyone knows we're spending a lot of money, but we're not actually solving the problem. We're just treating symptoms, and we're not even doing that well. And I think that's where we're seeing there's a willingness to reallocate resources, and that's where we also get scale from, where cities like Barcelona, we run a program, a $1.5 million procurement. That's not very much. That's, the city has $2.5 billion in spending. But it starts to indicate that actually we can open up these kind of transactions at bigger scale, and I think all of us pushing the boundary a little further. Doing this with one city inspires 100 others to move up to the next bar.
I mean, and just to follow up on that, I think it is a cultural piece too. When you talk about procurement, there are so many long-standing practices. So for these new approaches, it's more how do you engender that cultural perspective where it's more we should try to do something different in this space. It's great to hear 1.5 million, also not a lot of money. When we talk about $5,000, that really is a drop in the bucket. But it is talking about, can you get to this great scaled solution? And for cities that are at different points in their experimentation, what we're also trying to figure out is this menu of options for cities. It's like, how do you approach this procurement so that you actually have flexibility, so that if you feel within your city you can really tackle a big problem, then that's incredible that CityMart's there. And then for the model that we tried for 5,000, it's a mitigated kind of cost risk that you're trying to address.
And I think on the city side, we need to make sure that we have the right players in the room when we're making these decisions, when we're framing these problems. So it's your subject matter experts, it's the person who wants to bring in the technology. It should be your attorney, your contract compliance person. I know.
Job security.
They all kind of need to be a part of that dialogue, because where I see the hiccups is when it gets to the contracting stage, and there's a lot of conversations that should have been had at the beginning of the stages that weren't had. And so then we see kind of a slowdown of the process because we're negotiating provisions that could have been taken care of had everybody been on the same page, been speaking the same language, and framing the same problem.
So maybe we could dig in on that a little bit more. There's a question from the audience, from Jess Montejano in San Francisco. I feel like a game show host suddenly. Who asks, he or she asks, how do you approach the internal-external politics of procurement reform and get executive buy-in? And I feel like this really ties into what you were just saying. If it is so critical to get the right people around the table and get them not just around the table, but sort of sharing their knowledge in a way where they're bringing their perspective, but they understand the overall goal. Like, what are effective strategies for doing that?
So I have to say, this design workshop that we did in Oakland actually really opened the conversation. It was the first time we asked all these different departments to come in and identify with a specific problem statement, and we're asked, well, what are your ideas about this? And I think just opening up that dialogue was huge, and it went to building empathy, but also this idea that we are empowered to think of our own solutions as well, which is huge in getting buy-in.
I'd say there's three key ingredients. What's the problem? Who has the problem, and what's the value exchange for engaging in the problem? And if you don't have all three, you have a field of dreams. And so being really clear in that last part about the value exchange, if you participate, what do you get and what do I get? And then you're really clear about the problem and the data behind it, and what's the burning, John Cotter, what's the burning platform here? It goes a long way to enabling the convening and the new thinking to occur.
So we're structuring this process. So we work with 54 cities. We are a very small company. We don't have offices in 54 cities. So many cities come to us and say, well, what problem do you suggest we solve? And it's very interesting that actually we found, because we're publishing all the solutions as well as the problems, that the cities are most interested in learning from each other what are the problem statements. And it's kind of, so to speak, the kind of most active asset that we're publishing. And what you find is we did a survey of 60 global cities and asked them, how do you find your problems and then how do you solve them? And it wouldn't surprise anyone in this audience that none of them had a method for going either about finding problems as well as solving them. And I think introducing this, educating them about how you find the low-hanging fruits, how you exercise success stories, and how you rally support around a problem statement without speculating about solutions. Because once you speculate about solutions, you get all the vested interests. And then people are much more reluctant to get inspired by new ways of doing things.
I mean, for me, when you talk about executive, in my context, it's definitely the elected mayor. Nashville has a strong mayor. And for me, it was as much experiencing a hackathon. And so he went to the National Day of Civic Hacking. He saw it. And a lot of it was just couching it in terms of what they are developing is not easily procured by us in government. So making it, a lot of folks have talked about design, so it was very much the empathy. It's like when you go and you see this innovation going on, and then you recognize that there's a barrier to getting it within City Hall, that helps to land a message with the executive within strong mayor context to then say, for us, we needed that $5,000 approach because it was a conservative first step. And we shared that we wanted to work with City Mart, and for us, we feel like it's a sequence of steps that we need to take to be able to get to that scale.
That makes a lot of sense. So well, it does. Way to be realistic. So I'm curious then, but a couple of things. One is, both of you have discussed, Sasha and Yahweh, you both discussed sort of intra-city collaboration in this environment. And do you think that is something that we're going to see more of, or do you see that as something that is like critical or valuable to moving the needle on this?
Well, so I think what we've seen is very, very difficult to get 2 or more cities to collaborate on solving one problem together. In fact, there's a track record on this, then all of this has failed in history forever. Whoever threw money at it didn't get it. And that is largely because procurement is not a financial process. It's a political, bureaucratic, and societal process. And it comes with a lot of very high stakes in terms of risks and getting it right and getting it wrong. And really, government is not really necessarily caring about how much money does it cost to solve that problem. It needs to be done in the way they want it, at the right time, and so forth. So sequencing that is a problem. What we found is that cities coming together and doing forward commitments, which is to say, if you can give us a school bus that is electric and that only costs $10,000, we'll buy 1,000 of them. And then you group cities around that kind of forward commitment of saying, we're going to be your next customers if you make that breakthrough. And that's, I think, a tool that is proven to work a little more around doing this. But we've had a really hard time, and it's taken us years to educate cities that it's okay to buy a solution that was invented by another city. Not just to steal some code, but actually to buy it with a vendor and do business with them. And, but equally, cities want to promote their own businesses. They understand that logic, that they're in a marketplace, and there's just too many of them, and too little money going around to just reinvent everything all over.
I think within the collaborative approach, I totally will echo what Sasha just said. We only had 4 cities, and we couldn't agree on a single problem. So it was more, again, how do we then just create this atmosphere of here are 3 innovation tracks. You, the community, submit some ideas that, put on all hats, your residential hat, your employee hat, and submit something that you want to work on. We'll push out the data that's relevant. We'll, find the staff member that can be supportive of that issue. But I would say, collaboration is more possible through code. That is really observable through Code for America, through a lot of the fellowship and brigade programs. And so I do think that there's a future for collaborative approaches through cities if you aren't necessarily thinking of the biggest scale, but saying how do we share this code across and deploy an app simultaneously across cities.
So it's interesting, you're talking about scale, and you're also sort of talking about code as a mode of collaboration. And sometimes one of the things that I wonder when I sort of wander into cities, and we use the word procurement, and procurement is it's a crazy big umbrella word, right? Procurement inside a city can mean trying to figure out an innovative, sometimes can mean trying to figure out a way to buy an innovative, cloud-hosted technology. And it can also mean, how do we buy $20 million worth of office supplies, right? It kind of covers both of those. And I'm wondering, do any of you feel like the way that we discuss procurement around technology is actually an impediment? Do you feel like there are better or more nuanced ways that we could be having this discussion?
Yeah, I was thinking about this because the procurement bucket is very large. I mean, it goes beyond, just office supplies and
First
technology
you procure the
services.
bucket, and then you procure the things
Sure,
to put in the bucket.
but we procure wastewater systems, and we procure, contracts to revitalize old buildings. I mean, there's other ways to look at it, and I actually think in the economic development context, there are some useful examples, right? When you put out an RFP, it's a community. Typically, a community-driven process of this is what we want to see here in our community. It's not like we want a 10-story building with 100 windows and you have these specified outcomes. It's more goal-oriented, and I think there are other examples that already exist in government today that we could learn from and maybe adapt some of those procurement processes to IT services.
Yeah, I think there's focusing on problems, and there will be certain things. So the way we classify, so to speak, the part of procurement we deal with is not really by technology or not, but is by problem areas, where is there willingness and a consensus in the organization and in internal and external stakeholders that say, we really want to do something about, like in Stockholm, about the blind people, it wasn't acceptable anymore to just do nothing about them. And I think, and didn't go for that slightly cynical approach of giving them something that everyone knew wouldn't work. And I think the way we would classify it is simply, in some cities, this is the entire adult social care budget, $300 million, that they want to reform because they realize that they're not actually achieving the results they want to achieve. In other cities right now, we're running a challenge with San Francisco on the zero traffic death vision of the city. This is a new item for the city. It doesn't exist as a budget, but it's a policy objective that they're looking to find out how are we going to tackle that and what resources do we need to bring to that. So those are totally untraditional buckets, but they always come down to the same. You have a very clear idea of the problem you want to solve, and you have buy-in across the organization to tackle that.
I think the only other piece I'd add in from the conversation I gave a second ago was be clear about what you're trying to buy and why. Like, it isn't always a technology problem. That's why sometimes it's separate services, or services as bringing in consultancies to help you go work through an issue, or a systems integrator to go build something. That infrastructure can be a completely separate thing. And then the only other thing I would say is don't manage procurement by myth. That a lot of people get intimidated by the big umbrella word procurement and stop, or really back up. And really, if you can find some good partners, I'm glad you brought up lawyers. We need to embrace them, but work with the system to help understand the objectives that you're trying to achieve, and have them get bought in. They really will dig into the rules and understand what you can and can't do.
So to go back to a couple of questions from the audience in the time we have left, we've got one from Luke Fretwell of GovFresh. And he asks if any of you could talk about some examples of how you or other cities are creating procurement policies specifically for open source solutions, since we were discussing that briefly before.
I grew up in the Bay Area, and I approach open source as a great model. My perspective is that it is not yet fully demonstrated. There is an aspect of tragedy of the commons when you look at open source. But that doesn't mean that challenge is insurmountable. It is an additional process that I think if we integrate into procurement, so for example, if it were a criteria embedded within a procurement process that government look at an open source product first, then you can imagine that adds one more step to a procurement process. And so I don't know if that is necessarily the best approach to thinking about procurement reform. I think that the greatest promise around open source is actually partnerships with the civic brigade, and thinking through how exactly brigades can develop technology that's immediately relevant to their community, that is open source and shareable across different brigades, that can be integrated in different fashions. It's up to governments to figure out how best to partner with their brigades now to then support open source. So that's my current thinking, but it's always changing.
I think an interesting space where we've seen policies or emerging policies around open source is, for example, in the control system for lighting in cities. This is embedded technology in the wireless control system that comes with the light bulbs. But cities are buying that system for 25 years, and then they find that there's very little flexibility to adapt it and use it in the way they want to, and they find it's proprietary. So I think there are interesting spaces where those policies emerge, and in other kind of openness of hardware and other compatibility of technical systems in a similar way. But I would also agree that cities that have really strong open source policies, that doesn't seem to be a central. The problem tends to be, how do we improve the quality of life, or how do we provide more security, and then the technology then is a means that needs to be flexible enough to deliver that.
So we've got time for, I think, one more question. I'll take one more from the audience. This is from Art Chang of New York City, who asks, what are new procurement models that are live or in testing and not theoretical that you've seen? Perhaps not ones that you've done, but just ones that you've seen, or things that are interesting. Maybe something that people in the audience who work in cities could look to as an example for something that they might try.
Yeah, I wanted to give a shout out actually to the San Francisco Entrepreneur in Residence program, because that was an interesting initiative led by Jay Nath's office, where they brought in startup companies to actually work alongside government agencies to co-create solutions that were then tested actually within user insights from both inside government and outside government, and working with them to help procure contracts.
I'll do a shout out for Philadelphia too. I think Story is here, but they're running a Fast Forward program, which is similar in spirit to the Entrepreneur in Residence. And it really is taking that concept of government as laboratory and government as accessing the community as laboratory to be able to try to prove pilot concepts in partnership with, not just software developers and the technologist community, but then a broader base coming from the community to address issues. And I think with regard to flexible approaches to have access to the community as your laboratory, it's a great way to demonstrate at least a new service, a new product, and then ideally go through a more traditional procurement discussion with the city.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks to the panel. They were fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.